That first thing you play, that's so magical, And he was probably thinking in his mind, oh,
Jim Keltner stands as one of the most important drummers in rock history, though his name rarely appears in headlines. While others chased fame and recognition, Keltner provided the foundation that made legendary recordings possible. He was the steady pulse behind countless iconic tracks, the drummer who made musical giants sound even greater than they already were. Throughout his remarkable career, spanning more than 50 years, Keltner played alongside the biggest names in music. He was there when John Lennon poured his heart into recordings, capturing both the anger and gentleness in his performances. He provided the rhythmic backbone for Bob Dylan's electric explorations. He anchored the spiritual musical journeys of George Harrison and supported Eric Clapton through his blues expressions. In all these sessions and many more, Keltner served as the invisible structural support beneath some of rock music's most memorable moments. Great musicians are not created in a vacuum. They develop their craft by listening carefully to others, absorbing influences, and studying what came before them in quiet contemplation. Keltner approached drumming with the mindset of a dedicated student. He did not simply play his instrument, but listened with deep attention to recordings that taught him fundamental truths about rhythm, space, and soul. The albums that influenced him were not chosen for their flashiness or technical showmanship. Instead, they revealed something essential about when to play forcefully and when to step back, about serving the needs of a song rather than showcasing personal abilities. Drummers experience music differently than other listeners. They perceive the underlying skeleton before anything else. They sense the pulse before melody enters their awareness. The records that Keltner treasured most reveal a musician who valued groove above glory and authenticity above technical perfection. These 7 albums shaped the approach of a man who would go on to shape the sound of modern rock music. The Beatles released Rubber Soul in late 1965, and something fundamental shifted in popular music. The record was not about volume or aggression, but about creating something complete and satisfying. The drums on this album stopped attempting to impress audiences, and instead focused on listening to the other instruments. Ringo Starr played with the understanding that his role was to hold everything together rather than demand attention. Keltner recognized this approach immediately and described it as drumming that understands when breathing space is needed. Every drum fill on Rubber Soul served the song's purpose. Every beat left room for other elements to exist and flourish. Songs like In My Life and Norwegian Wood did not require powerful drumming. They needed patience and subtlety. Ringo's snare work maintained a gentle but firm quality, like a reassuring hand guiding you through an experience. The cymbals shimmered rather than crashed. The bass drum whispered its contribution instead of shouting for recognition. Keltner studied this restraint carefully. He came to understand that excellent drumming is not defined by what you choose to play, but by what you have the discipline to leave out. Silence can function as rhythm too. This album taught Keltner that groove does not require volume to be effective. It requires honesty and truth. The Beatles had moved beyond chasing screaming fans and were now pursuing emotional depth. Ringo followed them into that quieter, more profound territory. Keltner would carry these lessons into every recording session throughout his career. Sometimes the most powerful action a drummer can take is holding back, allowing the song to discover its own natural heartbeat, trusting that heartbeat and serving it by disappearing into the music. That creates magic. Music from Big Pink arrived in 1968, sounding completely different from the psychedelic experimentation dominating popular music at the time. This record had an earthy, organic quality. It sounded like wood and whiskey and long, dusty roads. Levon Helm's drumming was not technically flashy, but deeply truthful. He played as though he had learned rhythm from the earth itself. Keltner heard something sacred in that approach, recognizing drums that did not perform but testified to something real. Tracks like The Weight and Chest Fever moved with a strange, unhurried grace. Helm's drums rolled and tumbled naturally, like stones moving down a hillside. Nothing felt rushed or overly polished. The snare had grit and texture. The tom-toms breathed like living creatures. Keltner observed that Levon made listeners feel the actual room where recording took place. You could hear the space surrounding the drum kit and the air between the notes. This quality is rare because most drummers attempt to fill every available gap. Helm allowed the gaps to speak for themselves. What made this album essential was its complete honesty. The band did not try to imitate any other sound. They simply sounded like themselves without pretense. Helm's drumming formed the backbone of that authentic identity. His playing was loose but locked into the groove, rough around the edges but absolutely right. Keltner learned from this record that groove lives in imperfection and that soul emerges from playing what the song needs rather than what ego demands. Music from Big Pink was not flashy or showy. It was real, and reality always outlasts perfection.
What amazed Keltner most was the space Jackson created. He left room for the horn section to breathe, for Green's voice to float freely, for the bass to speak its truth. He did not crowd the song with unnecessary fills. He framed it perfectly. Keltner would carry this lesson into sessions with everyone from John Lennon to Eric Clapton. Sometimes the greatest power a drummer possesses is knowing when to pull back and when to let silence do the heavy work. Let's Stay Together proved that groove is not about volume, but about feeling. And Al Jackson Jr. had more genuine feel in one simple tap than most drummers discover in an entire lifetime of playing. Released in 1974, Feeds Don't Fail Me Now swung harder than almost anything else from that era. The album was a fever dream, combining funk, rock, jazz, and swamp boogie into something completely unique. Richie Hayward on drums played like someone possessed by rhythm itself. Keltner called it controlled chaos because Hayward could shift from a lazy shuffle to a freight train in a single measure. He made complexity sound completely effortless, which is a gift most drummers never find. Tracks like Oh Atlanta and Rock and Roll Doctor rolled with a swagger that felt both dangerous and joyful simultaneously. Hayward's grooves were slippery and unpredictable. They shifted and slid, but never lost their grip on the listener. His snare work cracked like a whip. His kick drum patterns danced around the beat instead of simply marking time. Keltner admired how Hayward played with tempo itself, stretching and contracting time as though it were made of rubber. That approach takes real courage because most drummers play it safe. Hayward played it alive and vital. What made this record essential was its refusal to fit into any category. Little Feat did not chase current trends. They created their own distinctive sound. And Hayward's drumming was the engine driving that wild, unpredictable machine. Keltner learned from this album that rhythm does not need to be predictable to be powerful. Groove can surprise you while still holding you tight. Feeds Don't Fail Me Now taught him that the best drumming serves the madness of the moment rather than taming it. It rides that energy all the way home. When Otis Blue dropped in 1965, it did not just define soul music, but became the very essence of it. Al Jackson Jr. was back behind the drum kit, once again proving that less is everything. Keltner called this album a lesson in how to disappear while still being felt throughout every moment. Jackson played with such beautiful simplicity that you almost forgot his presence. But removing him would cause the entire structure to collapse. Tracks like Respect and I've Been Loving You Too Long move with a grace that felt almost religious in nature. Jackson's drums did not announce themselves loudly. They supported and lifted everything around them. They gave Otis Redding room to cry, to plead, to soar emotionally. The hi-hat work was delicate and precise. The snare hits were exact but never cold or mechanical. Everything breathed together like one living organism. Keltner studied how Jackson became invisible while remaining absolutely essential. That represents the hardest thing a drummer can accomplish. What struck Keltner most deeply was the pure emotion. Jackson did not simply play rhythms mechanically, he played feelings. When Otis hurt, the drums ached. When Otis celebrated, the groove smiled. That connection between emotion and rhythm cannot be taught in any classroom. It must be lived and experienced. Otis Blue showed Keltner that great drumming is not about showing off technical ability, it is about showing up fully for the song, for the singer, for the truth being expressed. Jackson did not need fancy fills or complex patterns. He only needed to feel deeply. And when you feel that profoundly, drums become poetry. Released in 1972, Exile on Main Street was a beautiful mess of an album. It sounded like it had been recorded in a basement during a violent storm, which was not far from the truth. Charlie Watts played drums like someone who understood that perfection kills the soul. His groove on this album was loose and ragged, almost lazy in places, but it swung harder than anything polished ever could. Keltner called Charlie the king of understatement. He never played more than the song could carry. He simply laid down the groove and let it breathe naturally. Tracks like Tumbling Dice and Rocks Off rolled with a stumbling, drunken grace that felt completely authentic. Watts played behind the beat, dragging just enough to make everything feel heavy and real. His snare sound was raw and unprocessed. His cymbals crashed with attitude, but never with anger. The whole album felt like it might fall apart at any second, but it never did, because Charlie held the center steady. Keltner admired that confidence deeply. Playing simply in a complicated world takes genuine courage. What made Exile sacred to Keltner was its complete honesty. The Rolling Stones did not clean anything up in post-production. They let the dirt and imperfections show through. And Charlie Watts drummed through it all with a calm presence that felt eternal. No flash or tricks, just time, groove, and soul. Keltner learned from this album that rock and roll does not need to be tight and perfect to be right. Sometimes the best drumming sounds like that is barely trying, but underneath that casual ease is a master who knows exactly what he's doing. Charlie Watts was that master, and Exile on Main Street was his temple.
A Love Supreme was not a rock record, but it meant everything to Keltner's development. Released in 1964, this was a spiritual journey disguised as a jazz album. Elvin Jones on drums played like someone praying with his hands. Keltner called it the most fearless drumming he had ever encountered. Jones did not follow conventional rules. He created weather patterns with his playing, conjuring storms and calm, thunder and silence. All of it poured through his drum kit like he was channeling something beyond normal human experience. Keltner listened to this album until the grooves wore thin from repeated playing. He was searching for the secret behind its power, and the secret was surrender. Jones played polyrhythms that should not have worked mathematically, but somehow did. He layered beats on top of beats, creating rich textures instead of just marking time. On the title track, his drums swirled around John Coltrane's saxophone like wind around fire. He was not keeping time in any conventional sense. He was bending it, stretching it, making it elastic and alive. Keltner had never heard drumming that felt so free and so precise at the same time. It taught him that rhythm is not a cage confining musicians, but a conversation with the infinite. What made A Love Supreme the #1 album for Keltner was its courage. Elvin Jones played without any fear of being wrong. He trusted his instincts completely, and in that trust, he found transcendence. Keltner carried this album into every session throughout his career. It reminded him that drumming is not ultimately about technique or skill. It is about spirit, about listening so deeply that you become the music instead of just playing it. A Love Supreme was not simply an album to Keltner. It was a complete philosophy. And Jim Keltner built his entire career on what Elvin Jones taught him in those 4 movements. Play with your soul, and everything else will follow naturally.
These 7 albums represent more than just favorite records. They form the foundation of how Jim Keltner understood his instrument and his role in music. Each one taught him something essential about restraint, feeling, groove, honesty, and spiritual connection. Together, they shaped a drummer who would become one of the most recorded and respected musicians in rock history, not through flashy solos or technical showmanship, but through deep listening, genuine feeling, and selfless service to every song he touched.